Welcome to everyone who is joining us for this panel. Welcome to friends and colleagues and family over Zoom. I'm Susan Moffett, and it's a joy to be here with you today and moderating our second panel titled Shaping Minds, Shaping Communities, Education, Ethnicity, and Political Influence. These are three excellent senior honors theses, and in ways they all reminded me of political philosopher John Dewey, who some regard as the most optimistic of the late 19th century, early 20th century pantheon of reformers, including Marx and Durkheim and that whole crowd, because he believed that reformers could solve the basic economic and political problems of the times by acting directly on minds, morals, and culture. Schooling and communities counted for Dewey chiefly as a way to repair the great problems of modern life. Oh, and we have those problems of modern life, don't we? Yeah. So that optimism of continuing to look through schools and communities as a way to repair the problems of modern life, I think you'll see in each of these theses, along with the trouble that comes with that optimism. How do we actually do that? How do we reform through schools and communities and the politics that get in the way of those reforms? So we have three excellent theses to help us think through some of these questions. We will start with Isabella Mandel and her thesis on the effects of gentrification on school segregation, analysis of Denver public schools. We'll follow with Elise Barakat, Thank God for Mississippi, how science of reading laws diffused in 3 states. And we'll conclude with Lily Roth Shapiro's Expanding the Group, Nonprofits and Latino Identity Construction. Each of our speakers will have 10 minutes. I will give them signs as they approach the end point. We're going to save our questions for the end. Will you please join me? But we'll have lots of time for questions, so hold on to your good questions. We'll want to engage with our authors here very soon. So will you please join me in offering a warm welcome to our next round of senior honors presentations.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. My name is Isabella, and my thesis is called From Redlining and Busing to School Choice and Gentrification, Segregation by Design in Denver, Colorado. So to start, school segregation remains a reality in most mid to large-sized urban school districts across the U.S. And most policies seeking to promote educational equality takes this fact as an unfortunate but unchangeable reality and rarely focuses on school integration itself. So to better understand how and why this has happened, this thesis explores the ever-evolving relationship between school segregation and residential segregation. So I made this concept map to highlight and define some key dynamics that characterize changes in residential and school segregation. So on the right, we have housing dynamics. We start with redlining, the segregation of neighborhoods within the city, and then it goes into suburbanization, which starts in the 40s and takes us all the way into the 70s. And then as time progresses, gentrification becomes the leading dynamic in housing policy. And this, in the most broadly defined way, means the arrival of a wealthier group to a disinvested and predominantly low-income urban neighborhood. And then on the left side, we have the coinciding school dynamics. So we start with busing for integration, which spreads throughout the nation in the 70s. And then as time progresses, we move into school choice, which becomes the main policy of the 2000s and coincides with gentrification. So segregation remains in cities throughout all these dynamics and is often chalked up to the result of natural market forces, despite the reality that all of these dynamics to some degree have some government involvement, or as I'll call it in this presentation, state action. So in order to explore this further, this thesis takes the form of a place-based narrative of Denver, and more specifically of Denver Public Schools, or DPS. So with this context, I arrive at my thesis questions, and I'll just read the biggest one, which is how has the relationship between residential segregation and school segregation evolved throughout DPS history. Okay, so before I get into my findings, I'll just quickly get into why I chose Denver as a case study and a little bit about my methods. So first and foremost, Denver really well reflects the national trends in school and housing. And more specifically, Denver was the first district outside of the South to undergo court-ordered desegregation. And then moving more towards today, Denver has been touted as a key model for school choice. And at the same time, it's been deemed the second most widely gentrifying city in the US. In terms of my methods, I use a mixed method approach, which includes mostly archival research from online local newspaper archive, sorting through boxes at Denver Public Library, school board meeting minutes, legal documents, enrollment data, to name a few. And then all of this is supplemented by 4 key informant interviews that I think gave me key insight into Denver. Okay, so the overarching finding of my thesis is that the government structured markets to create and maintain school segregation and to privilege wealthy white families. So in order to prove this, I start with state-sponsored residential segregation in Denver. And this takes the form of residential segregation within neighborhoods in the city, and then also the government-sponsored creation of almost exclusively white suburbs that surround Denver. I'm happy to get more into that during the Q&A, but the key takeaway is that state-sponsored residential segregation translated directly into school segregation due to the school board's neighborhood school policy, where students are assigned to the school generally that's most closest to where they live. So in 1973, DPS was sued for intentionally segregating their schools. So the Keyes case, which eventually made it to the US Supreme Court, sought to determine whether school segregation in Denver was the result of state action, and if so, that would be unconstitutional. So ultimately, the Supreme Court found that DPS had intentionally segregated schools, but this finding was limited to the direct action of the school board, like gerrymandering of attendance zones, for example. So this ruling intentionally left out the role of state-sponsored residential segregation in creating these segregated schools. Therefore, rather than implicate the responsibility of the state to undo residential segregation, the courts limited the desegregation remedy to forced busing plan, which, according to the courts, could not cross into Denver's suburbs. So it's this reality that state-sponsored residential segregation was left unchallenged that facilitated the eventual abandonment of Denver's school desegregation efforts in 1995 and the tacit re-entrenchment of school segregation. The court's justification for ending mandated segregation in Denver in 1995 rested on the idea that complete school desegregation was not a viable option in Denver, one, because it pushed white wealthy families to escape to the suburbs, and 2, because neighborhoods within Denver would inevitably remain segregated due to natural preferences. And as previously mentioned, both of these dynamics are in fact state-driven and not natural nor inevitable. So with the end of court-ordered segregation, schools rapidly resegregated in 1995. The second half of my thesis argues that this overarching finding also applies to the more recent era of school choice and gentrification in Denver. So by the 2000s, DPS Superintendent Michael Bennett blamed the city's, quote, failing and underperforming schools on the mass exodus of wealthy white families from the district that occurred during forced integration. From this perspective, school improvement for everyone within Denver therefore relied on bringing wealthy white families back to the district and the city. So in this way, school choice therefore emerged as a state-led strategy to attract wealthy white families to disinvested, predominantly Black and Latino neighborhoods in Denver by allowing these gentrifying families to avoid enrolling their children in their new neighborhoods, predominantly Black and Latino schools. So I'll just really quickly go over what this process actually looked like. So oftentimes charter schools, which are state-funded but privately operated schools, would open near traditional public schools in disinvested and segregated neighborhoods in Denver. And along with this, the state would simultaneously pursue the gentrification of these neighborhoods through various zoning, housing, and transportation policies. The next thing is that schools in gentrifying neighborhoods would face enrollment decline as gentrifying families use school choice to opt out of their neighborhood school. And because funding follows the student, this led to schools becoming increasingly under-resourced, and they then lose more students who have the means to leave. So this results in schools in gentrifying neighborhoods becoming increasingly segregated by race and class. And then the next phase of the school choice system maintains school segregation, but in a different way. So once a neighborhood has undergone substantial gentrification, the district then typically closes predominantly Black and Latino schools facing enrollment decline. And then these schools are often reopened as schools marketed directly towards the newly arrived white and wealthy families. So it's this system of school choice that ensures that schools in gentrifying neighborhoods go from almost entirely non-white and low income to majority white and wealthy with nothing in between. And finally, I put desegregation in quotations because while school choice does lead to temporary neighborhood integration by attracting wealthy white families into formerly segregated neighborhoods, it is ultimately a function of state-sponsored gentrification, which results in the takeover of neighborhoods by dominant groups. Okay, so for scholarly implications, I think that this thesis offers an important framework to evaluate the role of the state in producing segregation in mid to large school districts. And I also think that it demonstrates the unique ability of place-based narratives to outline how the role of the state influences school and housing segregation and how this evolves over time. For policy implications, while this could lead specifically to policy implications regarding controlled choice or affordable housing, I think that the main takeaway should be that the state created and maintained residential and school segregation and therefore has the responsibility and the unique ability to remedy it. But the government has simply never given desegregation a fair shot. And at the very least, a true attempt at desegregation in American cities would require the government to consider and remake the state-structured relationship between housing and schools. Thank you.
Please join me in welcoming Elizabeth Bearcat. Thank God for Mississippi, how the science of reading law is diffused in 3 states.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Elize, and I'll be presenting on my thesis titled Thank God for Mississippi, How Science of Reading Law is Diffused in 3 States. Thank you to Professor Moffitt, Dr. Arnzen, Professor Pangborn, and Professor Bassett for supporting me in my research. The phrase, thank God for Mississippi, has been used by Southern lawmakers whose states are close to the bottom in certain rankings. Dr. Kimyona Burke, who worked at Mississippi's Department of Education, has heard this phrase many times before. She told me, quote, "It was because they could always count on Mississippi to be last. We might be bad, we'll never be as bad as Mississippi," end quote. Most of the literature on policy diffusion and innovation would guide us to think that it is unlikely that a state like Mississippi, a typical follower state with a part-time legislature, would be capable of improving its education standings. However, Mississippi is considered the first state to have passed a science of reading law, which it called the Literacy-Based Promotion Act. From the time the bill was passed in 2013 to 2022, the state's 4th graders went from ranking 49th to 21st in literacy test scores. This progress has been dubbed the Mississippi Miracle. Existing literature does not offer theories for why follower states become leaders. This thesis investigated the question, under what conditions do laggard states become leader states for others? Science of reading laws require schools teach reading in a way that is backed by science, or the science of reading. While using evidence-based instruction may seem intuitive, these laws were intended to push back against what had become the most prevalent way to teach reading. The reading wars, or the debate over how to teach reading, has been documented for more than 100 years and revolves around 2 theories for how we believe children learn to read. So one group believed that children had to learn the building blocks of language, letters and their sounds, or phonics, and the other main school centered around the whole language method, which is based on the now disproven idea that children learn to read the same way they learn to speak, using cues like the context a word is used in or that word's part of speech. In the early 2000s, the whole language movement became associated with the progressive education movement, while phonics instruction became associated with the political right, as George W. Bush implemented Reading First as No Child Left Behind, which pushed for evidence-based methods in teaching reading. I used a mixed methods approach to understand the factors that encouraged Mississippi, Tennessee, and Georgia to create and pass science of reading laws at different times. All 3 states have similar demographics and are located in the same region of the US. I systematically analyzed primary source documents, legislative hearings, and laws through thematic analysis, through thematic coding and in vivo. I supplemented this archival research with newspaper articles and qualitative interviews with policymakers. I conducted 16 interviews with elected officials and members from state departments of education, about 5 from each state. I performed a qualitative dyadic analysis to determine if Mississippi's law influenced Tennessee's and Georgia's by noting explicit mentions of Mississippi as a model in these states. Finally, I conducted a search in the U.S. Newsstream database to see how frequently the term literacy was mentioned in national and local news sources over the last 10 years to see how media influenced the passage of science of reading legislation. Kingdon's policies, streams, frameworks reveal some of the factors that enabled Mississippi to not only innovate but lead policy diffusion. Kingdon writes that in a window of opportunity, the problem stream, the policy stream, and the political stream align, and there is a greater likelihood that a particular policy will rise to the top of the agenda. I add to this framework finding that in order for laggards to become leaders, they need strong leaders to follow. 2 leaders led the way for the Literacy-Based Promotion Act, former Florida Governor Jeb Bush and former Mississippi Governor Phil Bryant. I found that Mississippi policymakers learned from Bush's interest group, Excel in Ed, and Florida's executive order, Just Read Florida, which launched a statewide reading initiative and directed the state's Department of Education to work with local schools to assess and create standards based on the latest scientific evidence. However, the Literacy-Based Promotion Act has become widely considered as the first science of reading law due to its replicability and durability. Former Mississippi Governor Phil Bryant acted as a policy entrepreneur, leveraging the media and his network to build support for education reform in the state. Bryant's interest in literacy came from the fact that he struggled with reading in 4th grade. He told me, quote, "A 4th grade teacher, Mrs. Henley at Marshall Elementary School, the public elementary school in Jackson, took me aside and said, 'You're not dumb. You just have a reading disorder.' I'm not sure she called it dyslexia in those days, but she went about keeping me inside the classroom during recess and let other teachers watch her class while we worked on reading." Bryant said. This experience, he explained, showed him the impact a focus on early literacy could have on a person's future successes, as there is a strong correlation between low literacy rates and future academic achievement, poverty, and incarceration rates. Bryant's leadership and personal interest in improving education in the state produced a window of opportunity in which Bush and Excel in Ed could more easily promote science of reading in Mississippi. Finally, building trust at the community level was crucial for the Literacy-Based Promotion Act to get passed. Many interview subjects talked about meeting with teachers, other legislators, local media, and parents to adapt the law to fit these groups' needs and ensure that they understood what it would do. This was extremely important given that policymakers identified the state's history of strong local control as a countervailing force to this legislation. I found that there are 2 pathways for laggards to exert their influence. The first is through direct state-to-state diffusion, like in the case of Tennessee, and the second is by shaping national-level discourse and ideas that encourage other states to follow, like in the case of Georgia. Nearly every interview participant I spoke with from Tennessee highlighted how Mississippi's law informed Tennessee's. Mississippi's jump in the reading scores on the National Assessment for Educational Progress, also known as the nation's report card, helped bring the science of reading to policymakers' attention. Legislators also said that they worked directly with Mississippi officials while developing their law. Mentions of literacy peaked in local news sources around the time Tennessee passed its law, which is the second graph. Baumgartner and Jones write that policymaking aligns with a punctuated equilibrium model in which there are periods of consistent stability when policies remain unchanged, but sudden dramatic shifts can occur that cause policies to emerge or shift. Policymakers who are restricted by time and electoral considerations are more likely to focus on problems that have a lot of buzz around them. The increase in local media attention on literacy around the time Tennessee adopted a science of reading law reflects the shift that Baumgartner and Jones describe. Unlike the diffusion of Tennessee's law, policymakers in Georgia spoke of a broader wave of influence. In addition to Mississippi's, they cited that other states, districts, advocacy groups, and the national media inspired them to create and implement a science of reading law. Georgia's passage of the Early Literacy Act fits more closely with the punctuated equilibrium and the national mentions of literacy rather than the mentions of literacy in local Georgia newspapers. This could reflect the national wave of influence over this legislation. Bolden and Shippen explain how learning allowed for science of reading legislation to spread to other states. However, this thesis gives a more nuanced exploration of that learning by showing that there are two pathways for laggards to exert their influence. A senior official who was at the Tennessee Department of Education said that more states felt encouraged to pass a science of reading law after Tennessee did. Quote, "I would say states started doing this immediately after we passed it. I think North Carolina passed a law like literally 3 months after we did." They said, certain states may have been unlikely to follow Mississippi directly, but were compelled to pass science of reading laws when it became part of a national trend. These findings help inform advocacy efforts by revealing the power media has in shaping the agenda-setting process and the importance of mobilizing community members through spreading awareness around new legislation. Finally, in addition to what I've shared today, my thesis also addressed the impact the pandemic had on encouraging later adopters to pass this legislation and how the infamous legacy of the Common Core State Standard Initiative initially hurt some efforts to pass science of reading legislation, as people worried that science of reading laws would take away from local control over education. Thank you.
Thank you. And next we have Lily Roth Shapiro. Latino identity instruction.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay. Hi, I'm Lily. Before I start, I want to thank a few people. First, my advisors, Professor Weir and Professor Juicy-Knight. Thank you so much for all of your support throughout the year. And to Professor Pangborn, thank you for creating such a lovely thesis writing environment for our class during the fall. And to Cass, Jason, and Karina, the wonderful research librarians I was lucky enough to work with. And finally, to my friends at Brown, some of whom are here in the room today. Thank you guys for your support. I hope to always be surrounded by people as curious as you all are. Okay. So here are my research questions. My thesis explores how two organizations have navigated the challenges of appealing to an increasingly diverse Latino population, framed within the broader historical construction of Latino identity in the United States. I focus on two case studies, the Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund, or MALDEF, and Voto Latino. And I examine how their communication strategies have evolved over time and how they leverage specific political issues to resonate with and mobilize Latino communities. This all started because last summer I interned with the communications department at MALDEF at their Los Angeles headquarters, and my experience shaped this whole thesis and gave me kind of an up-close look into advocacy communication. So I saw this line of questioning and where my research questions came from as timely and relevant. Leading up to the 2024 election, there was a lot of media coverage on the Latino vote and the growth of the Latino population. Latinos are 19.1% of the US population as of 2022, which makes them the largest minority group. And at the same time, Latinos are the demographic group most likely to consume all of their political news from social media, which makes them particularly susceptible to misinformation online. And this underscores the importance of organizations like MALDEF and Voto Latino, and the importance of crafting messaging that is not only informative, but also combats prevalent misinformation narratives. Here's a little diagram I made with my research design. I chose to look at these two organizations because they reflect the broader shifts in how Latino identity has been communicated over time, each in their own way. They're also both well-established national nonprofits with wide reach and influence. And by comparing a legal defense fund like MALDEF with a civic engagement group like Voto Latino, I aim to kind of get a more holistic view of how different types of organizations navigate similar challenges. MALDEF was founded in 1968 in Texas and has a long history of legal advocacy for Latino civil rights. And in contrast, Voto Latino was founded in 2004, so it's much newer, and it has an explicit focus on mobilizing millennial and Gen Z Latinos through kind of digital platforms. And in order to anchor my analysis, I looked at 3 key election years, and this allowed me to track how both of these organizations have framed Latino identity and prioritized different issues across different political moments. For my methods, I conducted a qualitative text analysis. I manually coded Instagram posts from both MALDEF and Voto Latino. MALDEF didn't have an Instagram in 2016, so I looked at its press releases instead. I then used Python and Vivo to build my data set and to develop a code list based on words and key phrases that related to my research questions. And then after narrowing my sample for a feasible analysis, I applied these codes to the text. And here you can see the 4 most common issue areas: education, immigrants' rights, freedom from bias and discrimination, and voting rights were the 4 most referenced issues in these Instagram posts. And immigrants' rights and voting rights were the top 2, so I chose to kind of dig deeper into those. I analyzed all the posts that referenced those 2 issues and looked across these 6 additional lines of coding to better understand the kinds of language that these 2 organizations use. So one of the key findings from my research is that both organizations have broadened their definition of Latino over time and have adjusted their language to reflect the group's growing diversity. For example, MALDEF focused initially on Mexican Americans, but over the years, its terminology has shifted from Hispanic to Latino, which mirrors broader cultural shifts and political shifts as well. And Voto Latino, on the other hand, has always used the term Latino, but in more recent years, it has also incorporated terms like Latinx and Latina to be more inclusive in its outreach. Both organizations have increasingly positioned Latinos in solidarity with other marginalized communities in the US, like undocumented immigrants and Black Americans. A second central finding relates to emotional tone. MALDEF often uses urgent and cautionary messaging, emphasizing that civil rights are in danger and that the organization is essential to defending them. In contrast, Voto Latino adopts a more consistently positive tone in its messaging. Its communications are more focused on hope, empowerment, and motivating people, especially young people, to vote. And this difference in tone kind of reflects the organization's distinct goals. MALDEF is more concerned with legal defense and rights protection, whereas Voto Latino is focused on civic engagement and political mobilization. And then finally, this project highlights that ethno-racial identity in the United States is not fixed. It's constructed and negotiated and constantly evolving. And organizations like MALDEF and Voto Latino are not only responding to these shifts, but they're actively shaping how Latino identity is framed and understood in public discourse. So some conclusions. Communicating effectively with an increasingly diverse group like Latinos presents a rich area for future research. When I was kind of doing this whole thing, there were no established best practices for analyzing Instagram communications in this context. So there's kind of room for methodological development there. The intersection of Latino identity, politics, and social media is central to understanding how ethno-racial identity is constructed and negotiated in the US, and it offers critical insight into patterns of Latino political behavior and the changing role of identity-based advocacy nonprofits. In terms of political mobilization, in order to build stronger and more durable support among Latino constituents, organizations must engage with the policy areas that matter most to people's everyday lives. The modest but notable shift towards Trump among Latino voters in 2024 suggests that economic concerns are a driving force. Sometimes they may outweigh other political priorities like immigration reform or abortion rights. And so for organizations like MALDEF and Voto Latino, this raises an important question of how economic issues can be more fully incorporated into their communications while still aligning with their core missions. In terms of the future of messaging, Trump's presidency continues to pose political, legal, and financial challenges for these sorts of advocacy organizations. As we know, immigrant protections are increasingly under threat, which directly affects MALDEF's legal advocacy work. And at the same time, Voto Latino's work is increasingly important in light of misinformation and the prevalence of that online, which, as I mentioned before, is where many Latinos get their political news. And yeah, just to kind of wrap things up, these organizations have to navigate the complex tensions of a shifting identity landscape. Political identity is not just shaped by ethnicity or race, it's also informed by economic background, class, and education. And so for advocacy groups to remain relevant and effective, they must treat their communication strategies as iterative and adaptive projects, especially as the Latino population continues to grow and diversify. And recognizing the dynamic nature of ethno-racial identity is essential to building broader coalitions and creating a more inclusive form of political representation. Thank you.
Now we'll take some questions. Get your questions ready. Excellent, all three of you. I'd like to start with the first question. And all three of you have done an impressive amount of research in just one short year. But imagine you had a second year. What would you do with that second year related to this research? What would you like to find, perhaps, that you weren't able to find this year? We'll just go in order of the presentations.
Yeah. Well, I'll just speak out loud. I really appreciate that question, and something I kind of glossed over in my presentation, or actually skipped for the sake of time, is that Denver public schools, the majority is actually Latino students, and they are very uniquely impacted by the changing relationship between residential and school segregation. And this manifests mostly in the impacts on their access to bilingual, bicultural education. So back when in the 70s during the Keys Supreme Court case, moves to court mandated desegregation actually negatively impacted some Latino students because their schools were then desegregated and they had to go to white schools that didn't have the programming for bilingual education. And then this evolves in different ways for gentrification and school choice, because a lot of Latino students are attending schools in gentrifying neighborhoods, and when they become more white, sometimes they have a court-mandated threshold where if there's 50 Latino students, they have to offer a quality bilingual education. And once you lose that threshold, then schools no longer have to offer it. So that's something that came up a lot in my research and was just beyond the scope of my thesis, but I would love to get into that in my second year.
And Elise.
Yeah, thank you for that. In my conclusion, I addressed some of the factors that are shaping the current landscape of the science of reading laws. Two of those factors I can talk about right now. So one of them is the role of teachers' unions in where states are being able to pass these laws and where they're seeing some resistance. And the second is the consequences of these reforms and forgetting what we learned from the whole language movement. So kind of what I talked about, it's not the most effective method for teaching students to read, but it did bring along an emphasis on quality books and more exciting instructional materials and a lot of teacher support. And so making sure that these aspects of the whole language movement don't get forgotten, and kind of looking at the dynamic between these two movements.
Great. Lily.
Yeah, thank you. I think there are a lot of things I would have liked to do with a second year. When I first started out, I had planned to kind of conduct interviews with key informants at each of the organizations, with people who work in the communications departments. But given nature of time, I wasn't able to do that. So that's definitely something I would have liked to do, to kind of get a kind of behind the scenes insider perspective on the choices they make in terms of messaging. I also could have looked at more years, either other election years, off-cycle years, to see how the political issues they're prioritizing shift over time. And I also had been looking at a couple of other organizations to consider. Unidos US and LULAC were two of the top contenders. So I think more studies in the future could look at some other organizations in this space to get a bigger view of the field.
Yeah, good. Let's take some questions from the audience.
Congratulations for wonderful presentations on very exciting topics. I also have a general question for you. You set out to do these research projects. What was the biggest surprise that you encountered in your research? And this can be either in the process of it or the findings or anything else that happened during this time. Thank you.
I can start. I really appreciate that question. I think something that it wasn't necessarily a surprise, but more of just I feel really appreciative of it and kind of surprised by the extent to which the key informants that I interviewed were willing to talk to me. One of the interviewees spoke to me for like 4 hours, which I was not expecting. But everyone was super knowledgeable about their own research. Most of the key informants were either journalists or activists in Denver. Some were hired by DPS itself, but also were advocating against it at the same time. So everyone who was just willing to take the time to talk to me, I was greatly appreciative of this and just kind of inspired by all of the on-the-ground work that's being done to call out school choice and to frame it in this bigger idea of community takeover and gentrification, bridging all these like complex ideas together. The work is being done, and it was really cool to see that. And I was just really appreciative of the time that was given to me to discuss that.
Yeah, thank you for your question. I would say going into my interviews, I had expected, to back up, science of reading laws, the passage of them coincides with the fall of the Common Core State Standards Initiative. So going into these interviews, I expected that to be a big talking point, and I expected my findings to show that the fall of Common Core was a launching pad for these laws that pushed for more state control. But I actually found that the legacy of Common Core actually hurt a lot of science of reading initiatives because states were more, at least the states I was focused on, were more pushing for local control. And so they were worried that these state level laws would take away from that.
I think this is something that we actually spoke about when we met earlier in the year. But I think for me, the biggest surprise was just how long the data kind of collection and analysis process took. That was definitely a big learning curve dealing with Python and Vivo. But yeah, I think that I kind of had expected that doing more archival and literature review type of research would take me the longest, but it actually turned out to be the actual coding process of my data. So that was definitely a surprise.
Other questions? Yes, Professor Zarate.
Thank you all so much. I have a question for Lily. So first off, congratulations. I know we've had the chance to speak about this project a few times throughout the semester, so it was really cool to see how it ended up. This question is perhaps beyond the scope of what you presented, but I'm just kind of curious to get your thoughts. So I liked how within these posts you're doing a sentiment analysis between if it was positive or negative messaging, and thinking about I guess two things. One, just Latino identity strength, how they feel about their identity, but then also voter turnout, right? Because Latinos tend to be the group that turns out the least compared to other racial and ethnic groups. Do you kind of believe that one type of messaging, either positive or negative, trying to feel anger versus enthusiasm, might have differential effects on both identity and also just the general turnout of the group? I'd be really curious to get your thoughts.
That's a great question. Thank you. I think that there are kind of a bunch of different factors at play. When I was kind of looking at the negative and positive across MALDEF and Voto Latino, it seemed to me that since MALDEF doesn't really require people to take individual action, it just requires public support for the work that the organization itself is doing on behalf of Latinos. That may suggest that maybe more positive messaging is more effective at getting people to actually take individual action. But I think another big factor, or maybe bigger factor, is the actual kind of issues or the content of the messaging itself, kind of what I was talking about in terms of issue areas, and kind of really paying attention to what people are being affected by in their day-to-day lives, and taking that into account rather than just kind of the bigger issues being maybe talked about more in kind of mainstream political, like on those platforms. I think that might be a bigger kind of factor that gets people to turn out or not.
Professor Levitas.
Two questions, one for Elise and one for Izzy. Elise, one does not usually associate Mississippi with evidence-based policymaking and science. And is this a case of a broken clock being right twice a day, or is there some domestic politics, internal state politics, that rather than just simply leadership from the top, that made this possible in Mississippi so early? And then for Izzy, who I can't see, which is a shame, this idea that busing is to redlining and suburbanization as school choice is to gentrification is pretty powerful. But the thing that's weird about this is that suburban power stands around in both of them. And I'm just wondering, given that school choices seems to be here to stay, what are the possible remedies going forward with respect to housing and zoning policies that you might want to point to as possibilities?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So kind of what you said about like that top-down leadership was so influential. So every single person I spoke to from Mississippi talked about how former Governor Phil Bryant's leadership and guidance in pushing for education reform really shifted the focus of what people were focused on while he was in power. That being said, there were also some national level forces at play that I think were also quite interesting. So kind of what you're touching on, I think Democrats' dominance in education is something that's more typically thought of more so than Republicans. However, when talking, I spoke with 3 national level education journalists, and some of them spoke about how more conservative places going back to a method that was typically used and embracing a more conservative approach isn't that surprising when you frame it in that way. However, I'm with you there, where Mississippi being the start of this is quite surprising. And I think that does have to do with Phil Bryant's leadership.
Yeah, I totally agree with the assessment that suburban power is kind of at the core of a lot of the issues that I discussed. One thing, interestingly, there's a scholar named Heiss who concludes that school choice has already been unraveled and it's really hard to rein that back in. And he concludes that in order for this to be an equitable system, school choice needs to expand even further into suburban districts, because right now they're constricted to within the city. And if these are going to remain segregated, then that's really the only way to integrate schools. Something that I think my thesis points at, though, is that importantly, affordable housing efforts to desegregate suburbs, all of these things can have huge implications on school segregation itself. So whether it's moves to bring affordable housing into formerly exclusive suburbs, usually this is through changing like exclusive zoning policy. I think that can go miles in terms of both residential segregation and school segregation.
Professor Pangborn.
Hi, folks. Fantastic job, all 3 of you. So wonderful to see this all in its final version. I guess my question is for Lily in particular. You mentioned, I think on one of your slides, that, there's room for methodological innovation in this kind of area of examining Instagram posts in particular. And so I guess I'm curious, if you were to embark on that journey of sort of writing a methods paper or thinking systematically about how we can use this data to answer questions of interest, what are you thinking? Can you tell us a little bit more about those potential innovations?
Yeah, I think that for me, when I was kind of going about all of it, I was kind of jumping back and forth between all of the different things that I could analyze within the post. And so kind of maybe creating some sort of structured, it's always going to be iterative and back and forth, but I think maybe creating some sort of like structured way to go about the analysis would be useful. And kind of also coming up with a more systematic way of conducting sentiment analysis, because that can easily become very subjective. And I think that that's a really kind of key piece of the Instagram post. And then lastly would just be kind of how the actual image or video of the post interacts or doesn't interact with any text that's either in the image or in the caption.
I wondered if I could build on that question for Elise, thinking about your analysis of media and mainstream media. Usually, I'm wondering what would it look like? What would a social media analysis look like? And here I was thinking about your surprising findings about the Common Core, and expecting these two to be linked. So there's work suggesting that social media played a big part in taking down Common Core. It got hot on Twitter fast. And I'm curious if you would expect the science of reading to get hot, but in a positive way on Twitter or social media. Is there another way of, could that be a missing piece of data to explore in your second year?
Yeah, that's a great question. In my second year, I would definitely look more into social media posts. I did a little bit of that, looking at what advocacy groups were saying about science of reading. And so a lot of groups advocating for like dyslexia support groups are advocating for science of reading legislation. In terms of Common Core, I think that the findings would probably stay the same. I had one person from the Tennessee Department or State Department of Education saying that, teachers unions representatives were running around saying that science of reading was code for Common Core. And so just kind of picking at, I guess, people's fears in that. So I think it initially started as something negative, and especially in the case of Tennessee, and Tennessee's laws, they explicitly banned Common Core aligned instructional materials, which was completely unnecessary because there had been a previous law doing that. And so it was just to like put a bigger emphasis on distinguishing between science of reading and Common Core. And so I think I'd probably see a similar thing where people were first against it and then became more in favor of it when it was framed in that way.
Professor Ware.
So thank you all for really fascinating presentations. I have a general question. You were writing these theses during a period of strong political polarization in the U.S. with the parties further and further apart. And so my question is, how did that polarization affect the what you were studying, if at all? And what do you see going forward in the current political climate for the topics that you studied?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And it was constantly on my mind while doing this thesis, because how can it not be when there's talks of shutting down the entire Department of Education and I'm writing about school choice. Even last night, I got a Twitter notification. I don't use Twitter, but I still get the notifications. So the algorithm doesn't know who I am. I got a notification that Texas is like totally spreading school vouchers, going hard on that. And I looked at what the tweet said, and school choice in many ways, it's easy to make a compelling case. A lot of scholars say that white and wealthy families have had school choice all along. They are able to move to a new place and choose the school there, while other families can't. So it's interesting to see like polarization in the media, how all of these issues are framed. And honestly, when writing it, it just made me feel like these place-based narratives are an effective way of kind of contextualizing school choice in a broader way that really shows how they've been used to further school segregation. And I think it's all the more important as school choice is still on the rise.
Yeah, thank you. That was a great question. I would say that I one of the elements of my research was that I sent all the quotes that I would use directly from my interviews, and I sent them back to the people I interviewed, and they had the option to revise those exact statements. And I was surprised at how many of them, after reading them, pulled back a little bit. And so initially I had these like really strong sentiments. So for example, I had at least one person from each state that I interviewed saying that Common Core, their state standards were entirely based on Common Core, and that was like, they were exactly the same. And then people went back and they were like, they're pretty similar, but so it's a great point you make. I think definitely people, especially when having those conversations, felt very comfortable talking more or less casually with me. And then after seeing those statements out, I think we're reminded of the political environment we're in. Especially, I had a lot of policymakers talking about race. And I think that people then went back and made those statements a little bit more vague when they revised them.
Thank you. I think for me, political polarization in recent years has kind of very significantly impacted the landscape that I'm looking at. I think in particular, kind of the rise of Trump and MAGA's like rhetoric around immigration has kind of affected things in a bunch of different ways. But I think kind of it has forced like binary of grouping Latinos into like one single voting block that will vote like entirely one way or another, which obviously like isn't how things really work. But I think that a lot of narratives about immigration, and Trump linking unauthorized immigration to Latinos has kind of created that and exacerbated that. I think also in terms of just elections and voting and the rise of misinformation tied to the increasing political polarization, that has also affected kind of voting turnout and public opinion around like the two parties.
I think we have time for one more question. Or we can thank our scholars for this excellent research. Congratulations.